Everyone to this EUI, UE, as well as ECDPM joint project on evaluating EU trade agreements, gratefully benefiting from a lot of work that has been done under the RESPECT project. We encountered the EUI through a memorandum of understanding between the University of the West Indies and the EUI that was signed last year. I think we may have our newly elected Pro-Vice Chancellor, Dr. Stacey Kennedy, who may join or will be joining at some point. I wanted to also shout her out, but we are very happy to be doing this jointly. And I would love at this point to hand over the floor to Professor Bernard Huckman, who has been doing a lot of the work in bringing to the fore these analyses about soft power and the potential of the EU soft power in its negotiating and implementation of trade agreements, with a special focus in this webinar ultimately on the CARIFORUM EU processes. So over to you, Professor Huckman.
Thank you, and thank everyone for signing in. I understand that some of you are having difficulty with the registration process. My apologies for that. I think we can blame GDPR and our implementation of GDPR on that at the EUI. I'm going to share my screen. I'll have a brief presentation. Mia, can you allow me?
You should be allowed already.
Nope.
You should have the rights as co-host. Is it not working?
No.
Okay.
I don't know what to do.
Is there not a share screen button at the bottom? A green button?
I got it. Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. Blame the summer break. Okay, so I'm going to just spend maybe 5 minutes going through some takeaways from the overall project, and then Hugo is going to discuss or present one of the papers that has been generated as a result of the project, which focuses on the ex-ante impact assessment, the SIAs that are associated with EU trade agreements, but also the consultation process. And then after he's spoken, we'll have a short section on some reflections on our part on what the implications are of what we say in the paper for the ex-post evaluation of EU trade agreements, and we'll use the EPA, the CARIFORUM EPA evaluation as an example to provide some context to that. So I'm going to speak that all of this is under the umbrella of RESPECT, which is an acronym that stands for Realizing Europe's Soft Power in External Cooperation and Trade. We spent a whole afternoon coming up with that acronym. And essentially what the focus of the project is on is to try and get a better handle on the empirical evidence and the operation of the linkage between trade and non-trade policy objectives, which are essentially embedded in the Treaty on the European Union, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and it's a core kind of element of the EU's trade policy strategy. And we see that again emphasized in the trade policy review document that was released recently. And essentially what that translates into is the inclusion of a number of what we call non-trade policy objectives relating to labor rights, human rights, civil rights, environmental provisions in EU trade agreements. Now, of course, there's a dimension of this in the unilateral preference programs of the EU, which we're not going to be talking about today. We're really going to be focusing on provisions in reciprocal trade agreements that have to do with these non-trade objectives. And essentially what it boils down to is a form of conditionality. Essentially what the EU is saying, if you want to trade with us or conclude an agreement with us, you have to make commitments in these areas, right? And what we're trying to do in the project is, among a lot of other things, we're trying to put some empirical evidence on the table with respect to, does this actually work? Using a multidisciplinary approach. So it happens that Hugo and myself are economists, but we have lawyers, we have political scientists who are also involved in this project. The conceptual framework for a lot of what we're doing is essentially to kind of disentangle the relationship between non-trade provisions in trade agreements and ask the question, does that actually do anything to affect non-trade outcomes? And essentially, this is just an empirical question, right? So there is no normative context here at all. It's simply a positive question. Do we see a relationship here in the data? We're not going to talk about that today, but there are papers on our website which do that and which try to do as much as they can to actually determine the direction of causality, which is something that really is a big problem in this empirical literature. The alternative channel, which I think is more relevant today, or not necessarily, but the alternative channel is, does trade actually do anything to affect non-trade outcomes, whether it be labor standards, whether it be environmental protection, what have you. And all of these relationships can work both ways, right? So through the inclusion of non-trade provisions in trade agreements, that might affect trade. And through that trade channel, we might have effects on non-trade policy outcomes, but also it can go the other way around, right? So depending on the kind of conditions that prevail on non-trade policy types of variables, that might affect trade because importers demand they have certain preferences with respect to how products are made, and therefore it all can go also in the other direction. So this is a very complicated beast empirically, and what we're trying to do in the project is to look at, does it work, right? So if I could put it very simplistically, I mean, do we see achievements on the non-trade policy side that are associated with linking it to trade and trade agreements? I think this is what I want to say a little bit about very quickly. In terms of getting an assessment of that, it's really important to also understand how those channels might actually work and how powerful they might be. And that's going to be a function, on the one hand, how serious are these trade agreements, right? So to what extent, what is the content of these provisions? Do they require changes in legislation? Are they enforceable, etc.? Do you actually find them in agreements? So insofar as we're pursuing non-trade objective number one, do we see that in trade agreements? And here the stylized fact is, over time, we've seen a really rapid and extensive increase in the number of these provisions in trade agreements. That's not just an EU phenomenon. We see that in other agreements as well. But that's the first thing to keep in mind. Clearly, there's a lot going on here in terms of putting this into the trade policy context. The other thing that is important, I think, and this is also for the EPA evaluation discussion later important, is to understand how important is the EU as a partner for countries. If the EU trades very little with a country, then clearly the leverage it might have by kind of linking trade to non-trade issues is going to be a lot lower, right? And here, it's important to bear in mind that over time, over the last 20 years or so, the EU has become increasingly unimportant for many countries, right? Now, that doesn't mean in an absolute sense that trade has fallen, but it does mean that in a relative sense, other countries have become more important for many of the EU's trading partners, right? And if you think about who that might be, but clearly that's the emerging economies, right? So emerging economies share of world trade has been rising steadily. And of course, China is the big player here in terms of a very rapid increase in market shares. So therefore, more and more countries are trading with China, but also with India, with Brazil, with the emerging economies. And that is going to potentially affect the efficacy of this strategy. Another stylized fact I just wanted to briefly put on the table. So we put together very large data sets in terms of what actually is the situation with respect to various non-trade policy outcome indicators. And it's actually interesting to see, because one of the things that the data show you is that there hasn't exactly been an upward march, right? So in some areas of non-trade issues, we've actually seen a deterioration in performance, right? So it's very varied. And essentially what these three graphs show you, so this one is for civil rights. So green is good, red is bad in terms of the direction of change. And you see it's a bit all over the place. You see countries that are really improving a lot, and you see countries that are regressing. You see the same thing on labor rights. So a number of countries are really doing much better over time in terms of indicators of labor rights. Others, we don't see that. And in fact, we see some where it's negative. Right now, the Caribbean here is a bit small, but the Caribbean kind of pops out as relatively green. So on the labor rights side, what the indicators suggest is that the movement is in the right direction. Environment, another important non-trade objective. Here you see lots of action, mostly in the right direction, in the sense that at least in terms of legal protection of environmental types of provisions and environmental legislation, we see improvements in a large number of countries over time. But again, not uniform, there is heterogeneity here. So what the project does is to try and disentangle and to kind of use a lot of data, both on inputs in terms of what's going on in terms of what's in trade agreements, and outputs, which are a lot of these non-trade types of indicators and the related variables. And basically the bottom line, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, you can find all of this on the Respect website, is a couple of messages come out really clearly from the research, and that are bolstered by very extensive consultations we've had with practitioners, with surveys that we have implemented to kind of get a sense of what people think with respect to what are the policy instruments that work, does trade work? And the one thing that comes out very clearly, which I assume will not be a surprise really to anyone, is that if you're serious about pursuing non-trade objectives, you need to use non-trade instruments. Trade per se is a weak read. There is no real compelling evidence that there is a positive relationship here in terms of causality going from we include non-trade provisions in trade agreements and that improves non-trade outcomes, right? So insofar as there is a relationship, it's going to be indirect, and that indirect channel is going to revolve very importantly around other types of instruments and whether those instruments are being used effectively and if they're tied to the trade agreement or not. We find that there's more evidence for FDI being affected by these types of non-trade provisions, but also that FDI might be a stronger channel to actually improve non-trade outcomes, stronger than trade per se. What we also argue in the paper, and this is where I give the floor to Hugo, is we argue that there's quite a bit that could be done to improve ex-ante sustainable impact assessments, to improve the consultation processes around the negotiation of trade agreements with a view to actually improving non-trade outcome, right? Whatever those might be. And of course, I'm generalizing hugely. A lot is going to depend on the specifics, but we do argue, and there are some papers, and Hugo is going to present one of them, that suggests we really need to improve the linkage between ex-ante assessment and ex-post monitoring and evaluation. Currently, this is something which is kind of in silos. We need to do much better to build one coherent approach to this to enhance effectiveness, ownership, and accountability of the process. So if you go to the website, which is written down here at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, you'll find a huge amount of outputs and reports and papers that have been generated over the last 2.5 years or so. I put some pictures of the covers of special issues and books that include a lot of that research. So for those of you who are interested, I wish you happy reading, and I will turn the floor over to Hugo. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Bernard. And as Bernard mentioned, this this paper is part of the overall Respect project, and it focuses on kind of it's a critical review of the EU Trade Sustainability Impact Assessments, or SIAs. And in this particular, well, this is a co-author with Bernard and Joe Francois. And in this particular paper, we look at the consultation process. So there are different elements of this sustainability impact assessments. And this is it's mainly focused on the consultation process. So these impact assessments are used by the Commission to inform policymakers on potential effects and also to engage with stakeholders. And to do this, these assessments have two main components. So the first one is a quantitative analysis of potential impacts, and this usually focus on mainly on economic effects, but not only, as we will see later. And this component usually, most of the SIAs, they use a CGE model to quantify and this economic effects. There are other methodologies, not only CGE. And for those that are not aware, CGE stands for computable general equilibrium model. So these are large scale models that are used for trade policy analysis or quantifying trade policy effects. And then the second component is a complementary consultation process with stakeholders. And both components are meant to not only cover the direct trade economic effects, but also what Bernard was referring to, NTPOs. So these are the non-trade objectives, which include sustainable development, the environment, labor and human rights, among others. So the main objective of this paper was to analyze the inclusiveness and effectiveness of the consultation process. So to do this, we provide a critical assessment of the current process, and then based on this critical review, we propose some or provide some recommendations on how to improve this process. And in this presentation, what I'm gonna cover is a bit the thematic coverage of NTPOs and SIAs and how that has changed, how the SIAs fit into the overall negotiation process. I'll go a bit quickly over those two, and then I will do a bit more on the main characteristics of the current SIAs and consultation process, the critical review we have, and then the recommendations. So from the Treaty of Lisbon, EU trade and investment policy in general should promote and support those NTPOs. And there are also several other legal institutional arrangements in the Union that kind of force the Commission to look at this. And this includes the Treaty of the Union, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, among others, and you can read them here. And also each of all the member countries, they also have different, committed to different international laws like the Human Declaration of Human Rights. So there is a mandate to look into these NTPOs in trade, when trade policy or trade agreements are signed. Cool. Going all the way around. Sorry, let me skip this. Okay, and there are two basic aspects of analyzing this trade policy effects. So the first is ex-ante, and this is you want to determine the substance of the policy interventions and how that how the design of the trade agreements is expected to affect the NTPOs. And then you have the ex-post dimension when you want to see where you analyze the implementation of the agreements, in which complementary actions were taken or not, and to monitor and evaluate those, the effects, how that trade agreement affected NTPOs or not. The SIAs are part of the ex-ante process, but as Bernard mentioned, one of the kind of the recommendations we give in this paper is that they should be used more in conjunction with the ex-post analysis. However, there's the first problematic issue with the SIAs is that they run in parallel to the actual negotiations. So it's ex-ante, but it's one of the issues is that it's really an ongoing process through the whole negotiations. Sorry that I keep on going the other way. So, the negotiation and ratification of a EU trade agreement it's a huge, very long process. And usually takes several years, and they're up to different stages where all the three EU governance bodies are included. And to kind of reduce those 30 different stages, we have five main stages. So there's preparatory, and this is where the European Commission starts or initiates the process of negotiation. Then you usually have a scoping report on potential effects. Then the trade SIA is commissioned. There's a tender issued. Then you have the commission is the mandate of the council, and this is the authorization to start negotiations, and the council gives negotiation directives. Then you have the negotiations themselves, which is usually what takes the longest. And then you have finalization and signature of a draft agreement, and this goes through different stages, legal stages, different departments, and at the very end you have the ratification by the Council and the European Parliament. The issue is that this whole process, if you read it in this in the different texts, it looks like a chronological sequence, but in practice, the CIAs are never concluded before the negotiations begin. So, in theory, you like that you have this ex-ante analysis, and then, you start negotiations, and then this will inform the negotiations before they start. But in reality, it's just an ongoing exercise that overlaps with the negotiations. And as an example, for example, the TTIP, the agreement between the Union and the United States, it was launched in June 2013. First negotiation round was beginning of July 2013. The SIA tender was published at the end of July of that year. And then the negotiations took they were running for 2.5 years, and then they ended without any conclusion at the end of 2016. And the final CIA report was published until March 2017. So as you see, there is kind of a broken linkage here between the, having this ex-ante assessment and the negotiations and even how those negotiations and you're still doing, finishing the report for that. And part of that, of course, is that these are huge reports that take a lot of time, a lot of, very big analysis, and the consultation process is also quite complex. Okay, so what is kind of behind this, the impact assessments is that, many of these trade agreements, they have modest economic wide effects, but this doesn't mean that they can have huge or big implications, not only trade, but also non-trade outcomes for specific groups, right? So that's kind of the, going a bit broader to economic, theory. We know that usually trade or on the aggregate, the effects will be positive and significant, but this doesn't mean, or actually part of that process of reaping those economic benefits means that you're going to have winners and losers from the trade agreement. And what you want from the, the aggregate effects are positive, but the trade agreements usually have distributable consequences, and there are also, that is related to how big the economic effects are. So, what you would like from this ex-ante impact assessments is precisely, to give magnitudes, how big those effects are, who is benefiting or who is being affected by those agreements. And then based on that analysis, you would like to have, you can change the design of the agreement to kind of reduce those negative effects, or you can have flanking measures to compensate for these effects. But of course, the this, just analyzing this is a really difficult task per se, only if you're analyzing the economic effects, right? So as I mentioned, just to analyze the economic effects of free trade agreement, we need to use this very big and complex models, CGE models. And there, you can get aggregate effects by, let's say, the expected effects on GDP, on different sectors, on different types of workers, depending how detailed that model is. But they're usually quite aggregate effects, and there's also quite of course, there's a lot of dependency on what the trade agreement will look like. So if the trade, because this SIAs are done parallel to negotiations, most of the time there's not a text, so you don't know exactly what the trade measures are going to be, how much tariffs are going to be reduced and which particular sectors, what are the non-tariff measures, which are the main component of these trade agreements. So, there's a lot of assumptions on what the trade agreement will look like, and this will go into the analysis of the CG model. So there's quite some uncertainty and some dependency of what we're modeling what that impact assessment will come. And then if you add NTPOs, this just compound the difficulties and complexities of the analysis. So, as I said, just getting economic, how GDP will be affected, how bilateral trade will be affected, how different sectors will be affected, how labor demand will be affected. That's complex enough. But if you add to that, what's the effects on environment, on different labor rights, human rights, and other topics, then the task is compounded. And part of this, so this paper was is kind of a second part of another analysis we did. I did on the SIAs, and in that first paper, I looked more into the quantitative side of the analysis. So as I mentioned before, this is we're looking more at the consultation process, and part of that survey, what the main findings were is that the thematic coverage of the SIAs has been increased over time. So this is directly related to the slide that Bernard presented before, where we see that the inclusion in NTPOs in trade agreements has been increasing. So accordingly, the analysis of the potential impact of those NTPOs and trade agreements has also been increasing. And then over time, also the methodology of the SIA has been formalized. So there are actually now 2 handbooks. So the latest handbook was in 2016 that was published by the Commission. So this gives guidance to the consultants that do the SIAs. Also, the consultation process has been improved and expanded. We'll touch upon this later. Mostly CGE models are used in the quantitative analysis. I think it's up to 80% of the CAs are based on CGE models. Others have some other kind of econometric tools or economic tools to make the assessments. However, one of the main findings was that even if this thematic coverage have been increasing and number of topics is increased, there is really very little direct quantitative effects of this NTPO. So most of the analysis in directly qualitative analysis, and here it's kind of some causal chain analysis where you say, okay, if for example, if the production of this sector is increasing, if that sector is polluting, so then you expect to have increase in pollution, or if this sector hires more men than women, or the other way, so then we expect that will create effects on gender wages, or the distribution of wages between male and females, but most of the time that's not analyzed directly. And in the CG models, you can do this. I mean, but usually, you can focus on some topics like gender inequality or environmental effects, or distribution effects at the household level, but then you have to kind of expand the CG model in that regard. So obviously you cannot expand in all directions. So mostly what is going on is that the SIAs, they kind of have this broad cover all these topics. Most of them are just, very indirectly treated. So that's, to put it a bit bluntly, it's a lot of quantity of many topics, but the quality of the analysis is not that good for many of those, or most of those topics. And for example, if we look well, this was just a count number of the number of NTPOs covered in the SAA. So as you can see, it's been steadily increasing. And the most recent ones are kind of double the amount of topics there are in the initial SIAs. And most of those new issues are labor issues and civil and political rights, and here is human rights. So most of that expansion goes through labor issues, which is something more related to economics, so a bit easier to analyze. But the human rights part, as we'll see, it's more difficult to analyze because it's a much broader topic. Okay, so kind of to illustrate how the SIAs work, in the paper we analyze a bit more how the human rights topics are evaluated in this assessment. And here there are some specific guidelines to how to conduct the human rights impact assessments. But however, these are a bit, or we consider they're insufficient. And why is this? Mainly because human rights, it's a very broad array of human activity. So human rights touches upon economic issues, about political issues, cultural issues, social issues, and then there is kind of related to why this, it's so broad topic. It's also there's not a systematic, evidence-based and standardized methodology to analyze this. So many scholars, especially human rights lawyers, have been advocated for the use of or development and use of tailor-made human rights impact assessments. However, there's, at least this is the evaluation of this paper that we used, Brando et al. In 2015, that there is not a robust HR human rights impact assessment methodology. We got some comments in this regard, and it seems that there's a lot of people working on this methodologies, and there seems to be some advancements on this that should be included and can be used. But most of the SIAs, they're still not using this. And part of this is because the consultants that do the SIAs, they have to cover all these topics. So when they come to the part of, okay, now we have to talk about human rights, they don't have the time and the resources to have an HR impact assessment. And part of the issues is that the handbook doesn't delimit the coverage of what human rights are. And part of the guidelines, for example, they're extremely simplistic recommendations. So it's like, you have a set of human rights, for example, child labor or gender equality or political issues, and then there's just a positive, negative, or neutral score to assess this, right? So this is kind of extremely simplistic way to look at very complex topics. And as I said before, the SIA is the only thing they can do, because they have kind of some of the broad economic effects, is just have this induced-based links between the economic outputs and the links with the different rights. As an example of how tenuous this link can be, for example, in the environmental goods agreement, the SIA, kind of the main positive effect they found of the agreement on human rights was this, that small solar lights or renewable energy projects that bring electricity to rural areas can allow people to work later, to enjoy leisure activities, and to read and write during the night, among other benefits. So as you can see, it's kind of very tenuous link on what the provisions in the trade agreements and the economic effects are with human rights. And this is it's not an exception, it's more the rule of how this, induction-based or chain analysis is it's done in the impact assessments. So, this just gives, when you go through this, the final SIA reports, you have this impression it's extremely arbitrary how to include the human rights, how to analyze it, and how to construct these links. And of course, even if these topics are covered, this kind of analysis gives you very limited useful information that can actually be used in the consultation process, but in the overall, political dialogues surrounding the trade agreements. And then also it's part of what the handbook say is that, the SIs should give some evidence-based, magnitude effects of this that can inform, and then this is actually not happening with most of the SIAs. Okay, and of course it's not per se a problem of the consultants or the SIA. It's just that you have to have a trade-off between how many topics you're going to cover and how deep you go on those topics. So because you have so many topics that need to be covered, and there's times constraints and also resource limitations, you cannot go in depth in all of these topics. And even even with these limitations, and even with this very shallow analysis, it still takes several months to finish this SIAs and the whole consultation process, and sometimes even years. So even this shallow analysis does take a lot of time and resources. So kind of the overall evaluation that we make is that there's the current way the SIAs are set provides scores quantitative evidence, not only for the policymakers but also for for the consultation process itself. And that's kind of a negative feedback loop, because if you don't have good assessment of what the potential impacts are, then the consultation process also doesn't have the basic information to have a dialogue or to have a discussion about those effects. And so part of the, now moving more to the consultation process. So a key function of the consultation process is to provide stakeholders to, a platform to express concerns of this. So kind of also the consultation process is used and can be used to kind of also, get feedback from the stakeholders to say, okay, we think that this trade agreement will have this potential negative impacts on people we represent or different populations. And in theory, this, the consultation process should also provide feedback to the negotiations. But as I mentioned before, this, there's just a parallel process, so that kind of that link is broken by construction. So, for instance, in many of the so they're kind of a big muse on how the consultation process does provide feedback to the negotiations and to the quantitative analysis. But for example, in this practitioner survey that Fiorina et al. Did in 2019, trade unions and NGOs disagreed or strongly disagreed, I think most of them, that the design of trade agreements is sufficiently informed by the consultation process. On the other hand, a lot of commission practitioners and consultants and firms thought that they agreed that they was well informed. So there's quite a dichotomy here on how the consultation process, how effective the consultation process is. And as I mentioned before, this part of having the handbooks, and part of the whole creating this handbooks and methodology was that there has been a push to expand and make the CP more inclusive over time. And for example, there has to be, when the SIA starts, there has to be a dedicated website and different communication tools on preliminary results of the SIA, some policy communications regarding the agreement, etc. And for example, we also consulted several of the or surveyed several of the consultants that were doing the SIAs, and they did think that there were linkages there, even if not direct and not for the specific trade agreements, but that the consultation process was somehow also informing the quantitative analysis, because if there was some topic that was raised, then the commission will ask the consultants to look a bit more in depth into that, and also sometimes even to the negotiation process. And this was most evident for the big trade agreements, or the ones that with big blocs like the US and Canada. And there you saw, for example, there were some topics that were really relevant that were brought up by the consultation process, and also just the political and public debate, and they had to be taken into account in the SA. However, even if with this, kind of improvement, slight improvement over time of the consultation process, we still think that several limitations remain, and the process needs to be overhauled, or at least look in a different light to make it more inclusive and effective. So now I move into our main recommendations to improve the CP. And so we identified 3 main issues that should be addressed in our opinion. So the first one is weighting the views and comments expressed during the consultation process. The other one is ensuring that the process involves and engage with a representative sample of stakeholders. This is because it's not completely clear who is part of the CP and how representative that is, especially in the partner countries. And finally, there should be, how it should be a better analysis of how changes in trade and the provisions of a trade agreement may and can impact different groups in society. So this last point will be like this interrelation between what is important from the consultation process and what the SIA, the quantitative analysis, is focusing on. So now the last slides, I will just focus on the specific recommendations that we make. So the first one is to revisit the design of the consultation surveys. So currently the SIA's consultations, they have a survey instrument that just asked, I think it's through the website, also through some emails to some specific groups that usually participate, but it's just a long list of topics, and they ask, is this topic going to be affected or not by the trade agreement? But this instrument, or the way the survey is designed, doesn't really identify or rank which are the most important topics and how important these topics are for specific stakeholders. So what we suggest is that the surveys will be redesigned so that include closed-ended questions and scaled questions on specific NTPOs that are of particular interest to that trade agreement. So it's not a one size fits all, but try to tailor-make that survey to the region or the partner countries that are involved and the specificities of the relationship between the EU and that partner country to those and the related NTPOs that may be important. And then with this, you can have some kind of identification and ranking of these NTPOs, and this will guide the SIA on, okay, let's, this is the 3-4 topics that are the most important. So then let's kind of focus the quantitative analysis on these topics. And then instead of having like, 20, 30, a list of 20, 30 topics that is usually like a tick box with, that sometimes is a section or a paragraph as the one I read before about the human rights and the environmental goods trade agreement, but it's, you can go deeper into that topic and provide, more, a better assessment of the potential impacts. The second recommendation we give is to have deliberative polling as an active element of the consultation process. So related to this, you can use the surveys to kind of create a sample of the stakeholders and their interests, and get from that, well, hopefully if there's a large participation of stakeholders to get a representative group of those stakeholders, and then implement the deliberative polling. So what this is that, you get this representative group of stakeholders, you bring them together, usually in small groups to discuss the trade and non-trade issues. And this is facilitated by trained moderators. So you can have, a fruitful and constructive discussion of these issues. And very important to this is then you should have, access to relevant information and expert information, or briefing materials that inform and can give better basis to the debate on facts or the most facts we know regarding those NTPOs. And then, when you do this, the goal of this polling is to get, kind of the different groups you have. So you get at the end prioritization. What are the policy, the topics that you want to focus analysis on, but also which policy instruments can be used to improve, can be used as flanking measures, for example, to reduce any potential negative effects of the agreement. And this, we consider that this deliberative polling would then address the weakness of the consultation process, that is, the lack of a weight of rank of what are the important topics, right? So why we have the impression now that you have this tick the box methodology where you have 30 topics and let's have an analysis of each of them. What we think it's more effective is, focus the consultation process on the specificities of that trade agreement with a specific region or partner region, and then prioritize which are the 3-4 topics that are most important, and then focus analysis on that. It doesn't mean that you just do those 3-4 topics, but you want to focus most of the analysis and provide more quantitative analysis if possible to those topics. And again, this can create a positive feedback loop with analysis, and also with the negotiations and the consultation process itself. And as I mentioned here, the important part of is, of course, all this, the discussion is one of the key issues is is having the right data of information to provide a basis for the discussion. So I'm kind of reiterating now, but basically you want to focus on the topics, get a better analysis of those topics, so you have a better basis of discussion of those topics. And sometimes you also have to be clear that some of these topics are really hard to or complex to analyze. So then you have to move away from the traditional CG model or indirect effects, and you need to look at other ways to analyze this. So it can be looking at past experiences with trade agreements or ex post evaluations, but also it can be engaging with international organizations that have specialized expertise. So, you also have to recognize that some of this will be difficult, and you'll need different, different methodologies or ways to try to come with some evidence of what the potential effects may be. And a bit of more like a more detailed example of what these deliberations can be, it's what's called the multi-stakeholder value chain based deliberations. So here what you have is that the deliberative polling is constructed around a specific value chain. So this is the the economic value chains of which are where the inputs come from, where the processes being the economic production, processes being where the consumers are, and then kind of engage those different parts of the value chain. So that will be not only it will be in the country, the EU, but also in the partner countries. And then with that, you can just look at more specific activities. So it'll be a way to go deeper, a bit deeper and a bit more concrete on specific effects. And this can also provide information on more specific worker types or economic activities or regions that could be affected by the trade agreement. So just to summarize,
I think
so we find this.
Hugo, I think it's clear. Let's move. We're running out of time.
Okay, perfect. Sorry for taking longer then.
Yeah, no, sorry, but yeah, we've gone over time. So I was going to say a little bit about the link between this and the ex post evaluation process. If we take the example of the CARIFORUM EPA evaluation, I'm not going to go into there. I don't want to take away time from Junior and from the discussion, because we do want to have a discussion. But the one point I would make here is that if you read the executive summary of the evaluation, there's a whole series of recommendations there. I would argue that almost each and every one of those recommendations is an illustration of the fact that the ex-ante analysis was not done in a serious way. in terms of identifying baselines, in terms of identifying what would need to be done to actually move the needle on priority non-trade objectives that stakeholders in the region are concerned with. So I think there is, if you think about how ex-ante assessments would be done if it was serious and if it wasn't just a tick the box type exercise, which I think unfortunately frequently it is, a lot of those recommendations that we find in the evaluation wouldn't need to be made because they would have been done before, right? So I think if you read the evaluation, it kind of illustrates to me that there's really a lot of work to be done in terms of making these assessments and evaluations work together better. So let me hand the floor now over to Junior, and then after Junior, we'll open it up for discussion. Thanks.
Sorry, Bernard, the agenda shifted slightly from the previous one, and I'm going to make a couple remarks on Junior as well, but mine will be quite short. So I hope that doesn't breed too much.
No, of course.
Yes, so I agree with you that the idea is really to generate as much of a discussion as possible and sort of to just frame it. Let me take the opportunity before I start with my remarks to acknowledge the presence of the newly appointed Global Affairs Vice Chancellor, Dr. Stacey Kennedy. If she can turn on her, I know she's busy with a lot of different things, but so she's sort of the lead in terms of promoting these kinds of very important collaborations with partners such as the EUI and ECDPM. So again, through these presentations, we see how important this work that Respect is doing is for us thinking about how to make better use and to negotiate better our agreements. This is a direct call for collaboration with partner institutions like those represented on this call, GIZ, the CARIFORUM Secretariat, the EU embassies in the Caribbean and satellite offices, CARICOM, so that some of this work can actually be filtered down to the region. The importance of the focus cannot be overstated, being emanating from the EU, which is one of our strongest and longest serving trade partners. In fact, it's the only country with which CARIFORUM has, as a unit, has a reciprocal relationship, and in a sense is moving beyond just the EPA into these post-Cotonou agreements. So this work has important resonance for the work that we are currently engaged in as a CARICOM region. I would recommend that these two papers that have been directly referenced in this webinar be read by all negotiators, which in spite of the EU focus has broader lessons for the way we engage more generally in negotiations. I'm going to really make two sets of remarks before I hand over to my learned colleague, Mr. Junior Lodge. They are sort of divided into, first, whether and how the EU's SIAs have influenced its interactions with CARIFORUM. So how does this work inform, or how should it inform how the EU interacts in the future with countries and groups of countries like ours? For instance, how carefully, the question becomes, has it complied with its own internal procedures and best practices in conceptualizing, negotiating, and ultimately implementing trade agreements, and in particular these non-trade or non-trade policy objectives? It tells us a little bit about the built-in mechanisms for consultations and whether they have really been put to best use in terms especially of the ex-ante discussion and the ex-post evaluation. And are they allowing for the prioritization of CARIFORUM EU needs and getting the widest cross-section of interests to come to the fore in these negotiating processes? And I can think most clearly and directly about the consultative mechanisms that we have ex post under the EPA, as well as the recently, I think Bernard was just referring to that, the ECORIS studies that was part of the ex post monitoring and evaluation of the CARIFORUM EPA. And some quotes from the study, both the RESPECT study more generally, as well as the consultation process that Hugo just sort of told us about, kind of come to mind in terms of how the EU can use this work to improve its engagement with the CARIFORUM. Sort of more regular analysis of the effectiveness of the EU external action in realizing these NTPOs is a necessary input into learning and adjusting the EU strategy to increase its effectiveness. Another quote that stood out for me is the contributions to the e-book argue for a more ambition by the EU in using its soft power to engage in partners in support of greater trade, including in services sectors, and to defend core values, but also doing more to promote economic development outcomes based on partners' priorities rather than its own. So kind of the work that has been generated from some of these papers sort of highlights the importance of the EU utilizing some of these processes to have more bespoke approaches to or formalizing and realizing these non-trade policy objectives through trade agreements. But the second area is really looking inward. What does this work tell us about how we can improve our own internal mechanisms for trade negotiations? Now, flawed as the authors may find the EU's approach in negotiating, we at CARICOM can utilize this as a way of us thinking more clearly and strategically about our own processes. How articulated are our steps in arriving at consensus and ultimately implementing and negotiating our trade agreements? What can we learn from some of this work that Respect has generated? And there are sort of 4 key areas that I just want to ask some questions before I head over to Junior. First, I think the question arises, even from what Hugo just described, is what can we learn about the limits of the CGE model itself in calculating the impacts of these non-trade policy objectives? What are the non-trade policy objectives that we in CARICOM prioritize? Is it the ones that are put forward on the table by the EU, or are there others that we should be looking at in engaging with the EU, engaging with other trade partners? And I just wanted to wonder, I begin to wonder whether non-trade objectives is even a relevant, is it a misnomer now? Because by virtue of these issues being included in trade agreements, they're no longer non-trade concerns. They're now very much associated with trade concerns. So when I first read it, I was like, what are we talking about? Obviously, the traditional divide between sort of market access considerations and the environment and human rights and civil rights. These are the siloed approach towards thinking about these issues as trade or non-trade concerns, to me, and food security is no longer necessarily apt. The third question I would ask is, how can we more effectively utilize the resources and the processes by countries like the EU to strategically engage our own stakeholders more effectively? The question is, if CARIFORUM and CARICOM countries may not have all the resources to engage in these consultations, how do we piggyback on the processes that the EU has engaged in order for us to foster this wider approach to consultation that is being suggested? And more importantly, to me, one of the biggest conclusions coming out of this work continues to be that there's not such a clear link between trade agreements and advancing these non-trade policy objectives, and that a more effective way, I think, Bernard, your work shows, is through foreign direct investment. This engages a wider portfolio of interests, not just the trade officials, not just the quoted discussions in CARICOM. We've known and heard about it, but also domestic constituencies and non-traditional stakeholders in the process that we need to invite more and more into the negotiations we have between the CARIFORUM region and other countries. I think this is really one of the key points, and it raises special questions in countries like those of my region, where civil society and foreign direct investment is not necessarily guaranteed. We are some of the most underinvested regions in the world increasingly. So if FDI is thought of as a more direct, effective way of advancing these non-trade policy concerns, and we don't have much investment, what are the other options for CARIFORUM in order to promote these objectives? And then I wanted to just talk about the consultations mechanism, which in Hugo's presentation got so much attention. And it behoves us to ask as CARIFORUM, are we speaking to the right people? Are we engaging in consultation sufficiently with the broad stakeholder interests that may not be well organized? As I mentioned, civil society in the Caribbean is not as well organized as in some of these other countries with which the EU negotiates. So this idea of deliberative polling, I thought, was excellent in the sense that it leads to more informed approaches towards consultations and ranking of preferences. But it does raise the question of whether or not the focus on consultations, as opposed to getting more effective ways of measuring the impact of these trade agreements on these non-trade policy objectives, sort of shifts the focus away from where we should really be concentrating, which is how to get better quantitative data. Because as much as you can consult, if people don't really know or they're not able to think about what impact these agreements may have on their sectors, we're still left in a little bit of a blind situation. And then ultimately, the question that is left with me is, what do we do with this information? There's so many papers that this respect sort of work has generated. How do we even begin to absorb it? And how do we absorb it and put it into practice for smaller countries like CARIFORUM, and think about, how to actually implement it in a way that will be to the advantage of us in the future? So I think if I can end on one note, it's that we need more of these webinars. We need respect to work with us in CARIFORUM to generate more of these excellent types of analyses. I saw that in the paper that just came out, there was a little section on the EU-Africa EPA and the impact of the respect work on thinking about that relationship. I would love to see that done for CARIFORUM. So I would invite all of those on this call to collaborate and get us to work more with respect to do this kind of analysis, because it's excellent work and we could benefit so much from it. That's all from me. Over to you, Junior.
Thank you very much. Always a hard act to follow, Genevieve, so thanks a lot. My comments are limited to three areas. One is with respect to the design of EU trade policies. The second is implementation of EU trade policies. And the third is in terms of the consultation exercise. Respect has done considerable, or the project has done considerable work. In fact, it's rather impressive, the expansive nature of the research and policy initiatives undertaken in 2.5 years, and really blown away by the volume of work that has been done. So respect deserves our respect. It is truly impressive. That I think it is also important for us to recognize some of the gaps. And I want to cite just two cursory examples. And again, speaking from my experience as working for Caribbean countries. One is obviously that there has not been any specific focus on agriculture. And agriculture, as we all know, is that intersection between the European Union and most developing countries. That has been the birth of our modern economic history. But more saliently, it is also obviously an area of economic interest for countries such as the Caribbean. And I would have appreciated some more specific effort being invested on looking at the impact of EU agriculture on developing countries, and in particular on those who are either within the ACP or in the Caribbean. Why? Because the pursuit of soft power is also about policy coherence and policy consistency. And if I look at the example that not only the European Union is now the world's leading agricultural exporter. Exports have doubled from 72 billion in 2002 to 185 billion in 2020. 185 billion is actually twice that of the GDP of CARIFORUM countries. So it is rather impressive what the European Union is exporting solely in terms of agricultural products. So we know that this is an area of great economic importance to the European Union, and that has benefited obviously from CAP reform and the Global Europe strategy. But also we know that in the pursuit of negotiations of FTA by the EU, quantitative restrictions on agricultural trade are banned by the EU with respect to all EPAs, except that with SADC. And the reason for that is because SADC, the EPA with SADC is basically a carryover, retrofitting of the TDCA. But in all other EPA configurations, quantitative restrictions are banned. And yet, at the same time, of the 27 FTAs that the European Union has negotiated, TRQs are present in all other. And we are talking about with a number of OECD countries, so with Switzerland and Norway, for example, but also wealthier developing countries in Latin America, so with Ecuador, with Chile, with Mexico, countries such as Egypt. And therefore, there's a dissonance between the trade and development policy aspirations of the European Union and how it is concretized with respect to agriculture. And it's, of course, agriculture has this role in terms of trying to forge poverty alleviation, but also it's important for food security. So it's an important juncture, it's an important test in terms of the efficacy of a trade and development partnership with the European Union. And there, I think that the inconsistency in the design of EU trade policy does indeed impair the bloc's appeal to be seen as an earnest development partner by a number of developing countries, if I may even include the Caribbean in that. So agriculture is one. The second area, and perhaps more topical, is also what is missing is in terms of looking at something like taxation. There's one reference to taxation, and I'm looking, my comments are actually informed by review of the draft final report and the report on consultations that recently presented by Hugo. But with respect to the draft final report, there's one reference to taxation in that voluminous report, and that is limited to trade in digital services. And therefore, in my view, that's a major oversight, precisely because taxation, certainly in the Caribbean context, as we all know, is rather salient, is rather important, and it actually is the source of tremendous friction between the European Union and CARIFORUM states at this juncture. And here, to be clear, this the concern that the Caribbean has on taxation is not because of a awareness or any objection, policy objection to deal with taxation at the global level. To the contrary, the Caribbean, all Caribbean states are members of the OECD Global Forum on Taxation and Information Exchange. And therefore, that in itself reflects a political commitment to forge a global construct on the treatment of taxation. However, what is of concern is obviously the rather unilateral nature of how the EU blacklisting has evolved. Since the first blacklisting effort was promulgated in December 2017, 8 CARIFORUM states have been affected. So more than half of CARIFORUM members. But of course, the concern extends beyond that. It is also in terms of the design of the blacklisting exercise. The fact that, for example, proven tax haven users, such as the United States and Turkey, are not affected. They appear to be beyond sanctions. Secondly, that EU member states themselves that are recognized by the Tax Justice Network as users of tax havens are not included in this exercise. The fact that, for example, this is a process that is not just limited to the EU level, that you also have individual member states that, in addition to the EU list, are also jumping on that bandwagon. And here I include the Netherlands. Sorry to mention that, Bernard. And then finally, of course, this is a research exercise or a fact-finding exercise that the EU conducts without ever sharing the results with its partner countries. So the issue here is not in terms of whether Caribbean countries are indeed willing to support taxation. No, to the contrary, it is in terms of how this is operationalized, which of course is part of also this gap between a great aspiration and how a policy measure is indeed reflected in reality. The second area of concern is in terms of implementation, which is that when we think of soft power, it is not simply about replicating policy measures. That is important, and we see examples of this throughout, especially in the Caribbean. The Caribbean has benefited considerably from its interaction, from its longstanding political ties with the European Union. If you look at the degree to which regional integration is embraced in the Caribbean, this is also a reflection of the longstanding relationship with the European Union. We have a nomenclature that also reflects European quote-unquote values. So, for example, we have communities. CARICOM is the Caribbean Community of States. That's not by accident. This is as a result of deep engagement with the European Union. So this is not, the issue is not in terms of whether there has been an embrace of what you would normally call soft European power. This is more in terms of how a number of these instruments have been operationalized. So I'll give you one example, and also to suggest that actually it is not simply a matter of borrowing from the European Union. I want to remind everyone that during EPA negotiations, for example, it was the Caribbean that tabled a proposal which is now anchored within the legal text that says that in order to facilitate foreign investment, there should be no reduction of either labor and environmental standards. There should be no offer of bribery. Those were initiatives undertaken by the Caribbean. So just to indicate that this is not in terms of the European Union monopolizing these universal values, actually. But just to indicate also, though, that when we think of implementation, or when we think in terms of soft power, it is not simply about policies. It is also about people. And I've been rather surprised, not just in terms of the papers that Respect has produced, but also in terms of the EU's own engagement within with developing countries, that there has been a reluctance to use a number of instruments or a number of capital that it has. And basically, why is there not a greater level of secondment offered by EU institutions? And here, we should also note that there are about 38 decentralized bodies, EU bodies. There are also, I think, 6 executive agencies that the European Union has. So in other words, the fixation should not solely be on interaction with the European Commission, the executive arm of the EU, but also with these bodies. And of those 38 decentralized bodies, the only one, to my knowledge, where there is a rather robust exchange is with the EU IPU. So on intellectual property, they do considerable work in terms of engaging with developing country partners on facilitating exchanges, best practices, ideas. But clearly this is an area where you can see tremendous value in propagating that kind of approach where there's a direct engagement with EU institutions beyond just the Commission and beyond just in terms of policy measures, that there should be a greater facility. And the worst thing is that the instruments to support such collaboration, such exchanges already exist. One, in terms of where most of these trade agreements do indeed allow for the facilitation of exchanges, communication on best practices. But two, there are also specific programs such as the Horizon program that facilitates exchanges. A lot of them, academic exchanges, yes, but they can also be in terms of policy exchanges. Which leads me to my final point, which is in terms of consultations. When I read a lot the report, Hugo's report, I must say that I saw a reference to consultation almost as an act of trying to canvass the views of stakeholders. And that is important. There's no question about that. That is important. But I would rather something that is a little bit more ambitious, not only for Mugo himself, but more also from the European Union, which is in terms of recognizing that we have moved beyond just the state being the sole development actor. That economic and social actors are themselves development partners, and they should be treated as such. And therefore, the big challenge is, how do we empower these non-state actors? How do we engage them effectively? Because it is only through effective engagement will you get ownership. Now, I fully recognize that a number of these NSAs, they play a particular game, which is that if they believe that they are fully wired into an agreement, then they own it, and therefore they cannot distance themselves from it. We know that. We have seen the experience of that. But clearly more effort has to be invested in terms of how we engage these development partners to fully realize the ambition of them being development partners. A final comment that I will make is in terms of there is a review being undertaken of the CARIFORUM EPA. And it is just an example, a rather cogent example in terms of, again, good intention resulting in bad practice, which is that the European Union commissioned a report or an evaluation for the 5th anniversary of the EPA and for the 10th anniversary of the EPA. It would be, in my view, far more judicious if this were to be a joint undertaking that could be jointly owned and therefore serve as the basis of not only identifying what are the gaps in implementation, but more importantly, charting the way forward to see what needs to be done in order to fully implement this agreement. With that, I yield. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Junior, for that, for these remarks. Lots to think about, lots to chew on, as usual. Let me just return the compliment. So I've been tasked with the challenge now of within the next 10 minutes, soliciting any comments from the audience, and we welcome your comments. If I just ask you to keep them short so that we can have as many as possible. I think we have Ambassador Quayo with his hand up. Is that still the case? Please go ahead, just unmute your mic and your video and go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, my camera has problems, so I will have to use my avatar. I hope it's okay. So thank you very much for the invitation and for this very interesting webinar. The main Dominican concerns right now with trade is reshoring. Right now, value chains are facing tremendous political pressure because of reshoring. We have benefited from offshoring, and are very much looking forward to contributing to successful nearshoring following geographical or treaty-based criteria. I think the EU is in a very interesting position because the EU has the largest network of agreements that can be used as elements for an eventual process of convergence that could reinforce EU's role in global value chain. How could this be done? I think this is not a question that can be answered very easily right now, but I'd like to throw this into the discussion because it needs long-term consideration. In terms of specific comments, Bernard Hockman's initial maps were very interesting. The one on civil rights gives the same color to the Dominican Republic as a number of other single-party system states. And we thought that having a multi-party democracy with alternance, the opposition is now in government in the Dominican Republic. We thought that civil rights were okay in the Dominican Republic, but it seems the map is saying otherwise. I wonder how could that be possible? Bernard is also very optimistic. Professor Hockman, for whom I have the greatest respect, is very optimistic when it comes to the role of FDI in raising the standards in destination markets. I think evidence, the practical evidence we see in the field is totally the opposite. When you see in tourism, for example, these large multinationals, they come and they adapt to the local standards. Instead of enforcing the standards they promote globally, they come and they adapt to the local standards, and instead of recycling, they don't recycle. Instead of seeking sustainability, well, the salaries are not really the best, or the labor standards complied are not the same as complied in originating markets, and so on. I think we shouldn't really be that optimistic with the role of FDI. There's a lot of potential there for them to also contribute in the way they should contribute by raising the standards for all. I think, however, the evidence is clear with respect to standards, voluntary standards such as fair trade. And when you see what's happened, at least in the Dominican Republic, with bananas and with cacao, you see that standards of living have improved, compliance with core labor standards have improved, and as a result, those communities where those crops are grown used to be the poorest in the Dominican Republic are now doing much better than many others. And I think that's something that might be an interesting element to bring into the discussion of non-trade issues into trade agreements. A couple of other comments about the last interventions. I think when Mr. Rojas Romagosa speaks, that's very difficult to quantify these non-trade issues. I think now we have a large data set arising from the compliance with Sustainable Development Goals that clearly illustrate how countries are complying with human rights and other non-trade issues. When you see all the indicators in the SDGs, these are the ones that tell you how countries are giving more education, are improving the quality of education, are caring better for the environment, are caring better, are improving their health systems. These are the human rights, okay? How labor and markets are improving and labor standards are being complied with. These are the human rights. And this is already measured. And I think having those data sets, I think if we use them creatively, can greatly illustrate what we need to illustrate. One last comment on Janiv's conclusion that more of this work is needed. I think more of this work is clearly needed, provided this work is complemented with field work. I think the relevance of computer and general equilibrium models, there are clear limitations. But when you go to the field and you see how individual products subject to these improved standards are changing the living conditions in the field, I think the picture that emerges is completely different, and you can actually see the value of trade. So these are the comments I wanted to make, and I thank you again for the opportunity.
That was wonderful. That was its own presentation, Ambassador. Thank you so much for these wonderful remarks. I'm going to see if there are any more before I ask the Professor and Hugo to conclude, taking into account all of these comments that were made and putting a fine point on it. Any other comments? Please jump in. Anyone? No? Okay. So, Bernard, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for the discussion and the questions, the comments. So let me just say a bit about, well, let me start with yours, reaction. So I think we really need to start by asking, why would you expect an effect in the first place? Right now, clearly this is all, there's very many of these potential things to focus on, but I think we need to be much clearer and much more honest about why and how you would expect trade to play a role. Right, and my take on a lot of these provisions and trade agreements is essentially it's an opportunity, it's a focal point, it's a way of actually doing what you said you would like to see done, and often it doesn't really get done. So I think that is really the challenge here. How do you use the opportunity to actually table these types of issues at a high level, right? Because you have to engage with your partner on this to actually focus on what are instruments and what are channels which can actually make a difference. So I agree completely with what you said in terms of what needs to be done. And I think what we do in the paper with Hugo and these various instruments and approaches we're suggesting is something which is not just about ex-ante assessment, it's something that should be done throughout the process, right? So and I think this also goes to Junior's point. You have to not just use these consultations as a way of asking people what they think. Essentially, you need to also use them to bring in potential actors, right? Groups that can help, groups that have a vested interest, skin in the game, who care about improving things, because those are also the ones who can identify what the appropriate instruments are. And again, my prior would be, it's almost never going to be trade, right? So in that sense, it's a bit unfortunate that it's becoming trade related the way you put it, because it really, it's not about trade. I don't really see how trade can help a whole lot. But so that's why our recommendations all go in the direction of making this kind of interaction dialogue much more effective, including focusing on specific supply chains. And I think what the ambassador was talking about is a very nice illustration of why that is important and how that can help. Because a lot of the literature that looks at the effects of foreign direct investment on these types of non-trade issues, virtually all of it that I'm familiar with focuses on goods and goods trade and the use of standards in supply chains or what have you. And I think the examples he mentioned on bananas, coffee, is exactly picking up what a lot of the empirical literature is also finding. Right? But when it comes to tourism, what he was saying, well, there, the investors adopt local standards, and that's not what we really want. So I think this is, again, an example of where if you were to have a platform associated with the tourism industry, where you bring together all of the various players, the investors, the workers, the travel agencies, what have you, you can actually help identify and push a bit in the direction of where you would like to go. And I'm saying you here as the host country, as the government and as the stakeholders in those countries. So I think I very much agree with what he was saying, and I think it's pretty much there. And it goes back to identify particular sectors, activities that you want to focus on as a country, as a government, and then implement the type of instruments that we've been talking about. And that includes, that also covers the fieldwork point that he made. Now, I should say that in the context of the RESPECT project, again, I mentioned Hugo and I are economists, we run regressions, we work with numbers, but there are a large number of people associated with the consortium who are political scientists. And in fact, what they did was fieldwork. So there's a lot of case studies, not so much on the Caribbean, but on other parts of the world where the European Union is engaged in, it actually does exactly what you were looking for. So again, let me thank everyone again. And let me just make one more point, which also goes back to Jan's question. I think what you really need to do is you need baselines, right? So you need to know where you're starting from. You need to know what you're trying to improve on. Right now, the ambassador mentioned civil rights in the Dominican Republic, and the data seem to be off. But I think we need to focus on, if you take that particular case as an example, what are the specific indicators you'd like to see improvement on? And then ask the question, okay, so where are we starting from? What are the instruments that are potentially available to generate that improvement? And then bring everyone around the table who has an interest in that in terms of actually making a difference and starting off with that baseline and seeing whether we actually see improvement over time. And I think that quantitative dimension at the moment is simply missing in a lot of what we're doing in the trade agreement context, which is why we get an evaluation report, which essentially complains again and again and again and again. We can't really evaluate because we don't know where we're starting from. And we can't really evaluate because we don't know what the objective is. So how can we determine what the change is that we're looking for and whether that change is positive or negative? We don't know, so we throw up our hands and we write some case stories and case studies and we talk to some people, but it really doesn't help move the process forward. So I think that's really where I would end. Thanks again for everyone.
Thank you so much. You did an excellent job of addressing so many points raised. Thank you so much, Professor. I'm going to end with Hugo. We're 3 minutes over. I think we deserve to give you an opportunity to make any closing remarks.
I think Bernard kind of summarized nicely most of the comments and how research is related to that. Just quickly to mention that, I mean, we know what economists that do the CGE models, the limitations they are. And I mean, this is well known, and that's why it's complemented with case studies and other analysis. And kind of the point we wanted to make was that you can focus more and let's go deeper into topics. You can just not go deeper in many topics. So it's like there is a trade-off there, and kind of our main recommendation is, prioritize what are the main topics you want to look at, what you want to focus on, and then the economics analysis can provide you with better data and and results related to that.
Thank you so much for that. Is it for me to close at this point? Let me just thank my co-organizers and co-hosts. San Bilal from the European Center for Development Policy Management, of course, the EUI and Bernard and his team at the European University Institute, and Kathleen Van Hove, again from the ECDPM. And let me also mention Ariana Bondi, who also was key in helping us organize it. And of course, to our speakers, Dr. Hugo, as well as Rojas Ramagosa, as well as, of course, my dear friend, Mr. Junior Lodge, Mia Sogman from the EUI and her team as well. Thank you all so much. We hope to be able to do something similar in the future. And thank you for your time. We will try to make the recording available, and we will provide it to the list of participants, those who were able to join and those who were not. So thank you all very much, and have a blessed afternoon or rest of morning. Goodbye, everyone.